the airport, and if you was with me last night, I read chapters 5 through 8 of Innocence, Diary of a King story, and 5 through 8 was taking him on his journey, heading into the direction of hell. Tonight, I will read the next 4 chapters, 9 through 12, and these chapters will show the beginning of Innocent's new life in his new land. Chapter 9, Landing at the Shores of Hell. The giant boat slowly pulled into a cove and was met by smaller boats. They began to line us up by the railing, and as the small boats would pull up beside us, a rope was put around our necks, and we were lowered down with our hands grasping from the top of the ropes. I thought my head would be pulled off. I thought about the pain my father had felt. I panicked for the rope, and finally grabbing it, was glad when my feet hit the floor of the small boat. I was the last one down, and as I got my breath, I noticed that the strangers were tying my ankles together with an older man in front of me. It was a Zulu. The Zulu man had veins and sweat all over his head. I could see the shape of the rope mark around his huge neck. Some of the men were gasping for air with some of their eyes rolling up into their forehead. The small boat was turned away from the giant one, and we headed straight toward the large crowd of evil men that had formed at the water's edge. As we neared the wooden structure, I heard sounds made like animals from my homeland. I saw 2 kids much younger than I, jumping around like the monkeys do when a big lioness had been spotted. Some of the crowd was spitting on us. I was feeling so humiliated. My heart was so sad it hurt, and the anger seemed to push on all sides of my head. Once we reached the steps, the boat was tied to the side poles, and we were led up out of the small boat and onto a structure. There was a large wooden box with steps leading to the top. We were taken up to the top of the box by fives. As I watched, one stranger with a thin branch stood at the top edge of the box, yelling down to the crowd. After a few gestures, a man came from the crowd and came up the steps. This stranger was dressed fully clothed and all in white with a tall cover for his head and white skins on his hands. He began that strange touching. He stopped in front of a young woman. He reached and pulled at her hair, snapping back her head. The stranger forced open the woman's mouth. I could see all her ivory white teeth, and she tried to cry but couldn't. The man then began to pull away the woman's cloth. The woman began to cry. He gestured at the man at the edge and moved down to the older man on the end. Again, the touching and gesturing. The stranger then turned and went down the steps. 2 more strangers came up the steps and took the woman and man down and led them to a wagon that held several more of my people. Again, I see one of my people, although dressed like some of the strangers, sitting up on the front of the wagon and leading the horses. My people were taken down the long road that led through the tall trees. I wondered where they had gone. As I looked down over the crowd, I saw hatred and fear on their faces. I wondered what they saw up on this wooden structure. They all seemed to be watching the Zulu. He was straining, trying to break the binds around his wrist. As he struggled, he seemed to grow, and with the sweat popping from his body, he began to let off smoke. I believed he would have killed every one of the strangers if he had broken the ropes, even those with the magic sticks. Suddenly, the whistling air was upon him, and he hit the floor, pulling me down with him. The whistling suddenly stopped with the waving of a hand by the stranger on the edge of the box. He said something, and the Zulu was taken apart from us and dragged down the steps and away to a tree trunk that sat next to the cage at the edge of the road. He was put into the cage with the end of the long rope coming through the poles and tied around the trunk. Once this was done, the stranger then returned, and the strange words and gesturing started again. It was now my turn. An old man with a stick for walking pointed up at me, exchanged words with the man on the box, and I was led down the steps. I looked to see what wagon was waiting for me, but there was none, as I was led to the cage where the Zulu was taken. 4 more of the men from my homeland were brought to the cage. I watched as all my people who had been taken from my homeland go into many different directions through the trees. I knew that their faces were gone from me forever. The crowd of strangers began to leave. The sun was beginning to hide itself on the other side of the world. I wondered if it was now shining on my homeland. I really missed it, but I knew that it would be a long and dangerous time before I would see it again. I noticed several other strangers and a tall black man heading toward the cage. They carried some cloths in their arms, and one of them had a long magic stick. This one had a devilish sneer on his face, and it looked as though one side of his face was swollen until he spat. Out came this black-looking liquid. Some of the liquid was hanging from his lips as he stuck the stick through the bars. The old man who had jested for us came up to the bars and started speaking. We had no idea what he was saying. Then the black man opened the door to the cage and entered. I noticed that he had a smell much like the strangers. His hair was much smoother than ours, but his darkness left no doubt that he was once from our homeland. The black man began handing us the cloths. Some was for our bottoms, and a few of us got some for our tops. He then said some words that I understood. Listen to me. Won't get hurt, and don't look at their eyes. The rest was above me, but I noticed some of the others began to put on the cloths. I had bottoms and finally managed to figure them out. The feel was confining, much like the ropes they would put around my neck. Once we were finished, the black man told us to go over to a structure that was about 100 feet to our right. We did. Inside were horses and cattle and straw. Mixed in with the straw were plenty of animal droppings. We were put into a corner of the structure and chained to one of the boards that ran along the right side of the stall. Then we were given milk and bread. The black man told us to find some sleep. He said the old man would return in the morning and we would be going home. Home? What home did he mean? I was just taken from my home. Again, the anger stirred. They all left the structure, but I could see that one of their men was left outside the door. I noticed the Zulu next to me began to push the straw out flat with his feet. He looked at me and pointed to my feet. I then did the same. The other men followed suit. We laid there all that night. I was wondering what was on their minds. Mine was filled with wonderings of what the old black man had said. Going home. What was home like in this place? How far was this home? Will we find others like us? I tried to sleep but couldn't. Not one of us got any sleep that night. Chapter 10, Going Home. The next morning, I was awakened by the sounds of a wagon and the whining of horses. The large door opened and the old man entered. He was wearing the same clothes from yesterday. He said something to the old black man and then approached us. He looked down at the Zulu and then hit him with his walking stick. This angered the Zulu and he tried to grab at the man but could not reach him. The black man then began whipping him with a strange looking whip. It seemed to have 3 straps. The Zulu was yelling and swearing at the same time. The old man gestured and the whipping stopped. I wonder what kind of man would beat his own people for one of these evil men. Then they put a large rope around the Zulu's neck and tied it to his hands. Then they put anchor chains on the rest of us and led us out the door to the wagon. I remember the day was very cloudy with no sun in the sky. The air smelled of rain, yet it was very muggy. We were put on the wagon and suddenly I was heading toward the road that led through the tall trees. As we passed through the trees, I noticed that the birds had different songs and there were no sounds of animals. Had the evil man killed them too? As I looked at the road, it seemed to stretch for days. I saw that it was leading up one of those large hills. The scenery was beautiful, even on a day like this. How could a place as beautiful as this be so evil? We rode for hours, it seemed, up and down hills and through all kinds of strange-looking trees. Suddenly, I saw what the old black men had called home. It was a huge place and looked to be made of stone. There were four large stones holding up the front of the home. There seemed to be two more homes on top of the first. All around the front were hundreds of flowers, all sizes and colors. And standing in front of the home, I could see two of their women with cloths that covered their entire body. Down on the ground in front was a crowd of my people of all ages, both men, women, and children of all sizes, and all dressed in tops and bottoms. Some even had funny looking skins on their feet. They looked like me, but their ways were different. They were looking at me just like the evil men. The evil men must have used their bad medicine on them. I noticed off to the left of the home a lot of wooden structures that looked like huts, yet made of strange shaped wood. I could see more of my people working beside the wooden structures in what looked like giant gardens with strange looking crops. We passed the big home and finally stopped at a structure much like the one we had just left. There, the old man gestured for us to get off. Once we were all off the wagon, the two strangers appeared and began taking off the ropes and chains. I felt like running down the road, but I knew that I would be running back to a strange place with all that strange touching. As we moved inside the structure, I noticed that a large crowd of my people had come to look at us, even the ones from the gardens. They seemed to come from everywhere and all had the look of the damned. Two of the strangers took the Zulu inside and quickly chained him to a large pole that stood by itself in the middle of the structure. The rest of us was led to a wall and pushed to the ground. The old black man did start bringing in women who began looking at us and touching like the evil men. I was puzzled. An older woman came over to me and began talking. I could not understand her, but her sound was like that of my grandmother. She began rubbing my hair and looking at my wounds. She then went over to the old man and said some strange words. He gestured and came back and pulled me up from the ground. I was led behind the older woman to one of the wooden structures. Once inside, my bindings were removed, and the black man left me alone with the woman. She pushed me to a bed and gestured for me to sit. I did. I noticed that there was a room for 3 other beds and 4 chairs were placed around an eating box. The older woman was taking a pot from the fire, came over to me and began tending my wounds. I wondered if she was the village doctor. As I again looked around, I realized that this must be my new home. I knew then that I must leave this place. The older woman completed her medicine, and I must agree I did feel better. She then led me to a back room that had a metal drum, only the drum had no top. She began taking hot water from the fire and pouring it in the drum. She noticed that I was watching her every move, but her manners never changed. I was thinking what she was going to cook in the drum with all that hot water. I then heard someone else enter the structure. I could hear laughing sounds, and then a boy who looked to be my age stuck his head through the door. He was laughing at me. Another head came through the door. It was a boy about half my size and age, although much more in color to the old evil man than to me. He looked very odd. The woman then gave me a solid piece of soap, pointed to the rags by the drum, and pointed at me. She then said something to the boys and went out the door, closing it behind her. I could hear faint laughter as I realized what the drum was for. I felt thankful to the older woman for this, for I knew I needed to dance in the water. As I watched, I listened to the sounds coming from beyond the walls. The tones of voices were very familiar, but the words were strange. I thought of my village. I wonder what happened to the Zulu. Was he now sitting in a drum? It must be a very large one. What had happened to the other men? I remembered the big home. What was it like inside? Who were the women? Were they as evil as the men? I finally finished myself and found a large mat by the fireplace. I spread it out and laid down my head. The woman's medicine had made me feel much better, and the washing had made me sleepy. As I closed my eyes, I listened again to the voices and felt safe for an instant. felt like I was home. That night I slept hard and sound. I dreamed of my family. I saw Abel taking his walk as a man. He was very proud that day. My father was grinning from ear to ear with all ivory showing. My grandmother was there and she too looked proud. I remember thinking that when I took my walk, I had hoped that they would be as proud of me as they were of Abel. I saw my people, all with familiar faces. I could sense myself crying, but still I dreamed. Chapter 11. My New Beginning. The next morning, I woke alarmed at my surroundings. I had forgotten where I was. Once I regained my senses, I looked at the door. There was no sound. I listened for the voices beyond the walls. They sound very faint and far away. As I opened the door, I could smell food. I was suddenly completely awakened by the smell. I entered the large room and looked around. No one was here with me. I could run and hide, but where do I run and where do I hide? I saw a bowl covered with a rag sitting on the eating box. Alongside it was round pieces of bread and a jug filled with milk. Inside the bowl was a white mass of something I had never seen before, but it smelled very good. I found that it was really good as I filled my mouth with the substance. I finished the entire meal and was very satisfied. It had been a long, long time since I had eaten like this, and it felt as though I had become strong. I looked at the sleeping areas and saw that the boys shared their space with much like me and Abel. I wondered if they were proud of each other like me and Abel were. As I looked around, I could see people like me walking back and forth freely. There were no ropes and chains. I wondered why they were still here. Why hadn't they run away from the evil men? Just then, the large boy came through the door. He stopped suddenly, pointed at me, and laughed. I then looked down and realized what the laughing was about. I had on no clothes. I was shaking at being in a strange place, and with the smell of the food, I had forgotten to put on my newfound cloth bottoms. I was very ashamed. I turned and ran back to the smaller room and reclothed myself. I then sat on the floor trying to let my humiliation pass when the boy entered the room. He just stood there looking at me. His features were like those of the people in my village. He had something and walked toward me. He reached down in a box and pulled out some funny looking skins. He pointed down to my feet and passed me the skins. I didn't know what to do, so the boy kneeled and raised my leg. He tried to place one of the skins on my foot. I stumbled and fell, almost hitting my chin on the metal drum. The boy laughed and I settled down, and the boy then placed both skins on my feet. The skins felt like they were choking my feet. I tried to pull them off, but the boy held my arms and nodded his head to the side. He then grabbed my hand and said, "Walk." I understood him and took several steps. This wasn't so bad, although I couldn't feel the bottom of my feet. He then said what sounded like a name. It was Aaron. He said it again and then pointed at me. I said, "Innocent Obatu." We sat and talked for hours, although I guess we probably didn't understand each other's words, but the feelings got us through it. I remember the little boy's name was Jesse, and the older woman's name was Mama. Her name was easy to say. The open drum was called a tub, and my bottoms were called pants. I finally felt I could be at ease now. Aaron seemed friendly enough. Now, if I could only find out what had happened to me and my family and why I knew this would take some time, probably a very long time. I then heard as Mama and Jesse came into the structure. I heard her call out to Aaron. He said something and left to meet her. There was some talking and I heard my name being called. It sent tremors through my body. It sounded just like my grandmother was calling me. I went into the larger room and Mama came over and put her arms around me. I wanted to pull away, but the feeling was good. I had really missed this feeling. Then Jesse and Aaron came to me and all were now holding me. Mama then said home, and I began to cry. That evening, we all sat around the box and ate. The food was good. I now didn't have others grabbing at my food or whips whistling in the air. I wondered how long this would last. I knew that the stranger didn't bring me this far for nothing. I wondered what his plans was for me. Where was he now? I hadn't seen him in 2 days now. I wondered what would tomorrow bring. For now, I would enjoy these feelings while I could. I knew that these also would not last. After eating, Mama took us all out on the front of the structure. We sat on the floor and looked out over the big fields. The sun was golden as it lay halfway between the ground and the trees. As I looked around, others were sitting out on their fronts, while some held hands and walked with no skins through the soft dirt on the edge of the fields. All seemed so peaceful, yet I could not help but wonder why they would stay in such a place. Aaron pulled my arm and pointed towards the big house. He said, "Evil man." Surely I knew these words. Then he said, "Master." This I knew was a word that I would hate for the rest of my life. We all stayed on the front till the sun fell from the sky. Jesse lay sleeping on Mama's lap while Aaron played with a limb, drawing pictures of birds in the dirt. On one of the birds, he drew a picture of a boy sitting on his back with his wings outstretched. He looked up at me and smiled. I wish that the bird was real and I was the boy. I would have it fly me back to my homeland, only I didn't know which way to tell the bird to go. Chapter 12, Fitting into My Brand New Life. I liked Aaron. He reminded me of a younger Abel, always moving about, seemingly restless as though he had a place to go, but something was always holding him back. Finally, Mama stood and gestured at us. She held Jesse in her arms and carried him inside where she placed him on his bed. As I was about to go back into the smaller room, Aaron grabbed my arm. He led me to his bed area and pointed at himself, then me. Mama had gotten the rags I had used and brought them to Aaron. He then pulled the rags from his bed and placed them on the floor beside mine. He then laid on the floor and went to sleep. I followed, knowing now that I had found a friend. That next morning was the beginning of a brand new life for me. Mama woke us up before the sun had showed his face. She said something to Aaron and he pulled me into the smaller room. There he poured water and gave me a rag. We washed and then went out to eat. The food was still new to the taste, but as good as the first time. Mama gave us a rag which was wrapped around bread and meat. After kissing her, Aaron took my hand and led me out the door. There must have been 20 to 30 of my people outside, men, women, and children, including the Zulu. They were all standing at the entrance of the large structure where the Zulus slept. 2 men and one of my people came out of the structure with funny-looking poles with medals on the ends. They began passing the objects out to the people, and as each one received a pole, they headed for the large fields. It was my turn. I grabbed the pole and looked at Aaron. He smiled and shook his head. We then went to the big field, and I noticed that everyone was using the odd-looking poles to turn over the dirt. They would then pull the grass out and throw it aside. This I did not understand. In my homeland, we surely would not dig up the grass. That was food for the animals, and without the grass, the animals would leave the area die, and that would take the food from our eating box. I knew my father would not enjoy seeing this. We worked all day destroying the grass. Several times I wanted to ask Aaron why this was so, but I didn't know the words, and I didn't want the evil man to start using the whips again, so I just did as everyone else did. The sun was very hot, but felt good on my back. Aaron seemed puzzled at why I seemed to like the sun. After that long ride in the belly of a giant boat, anyone would have loved the sun. At dark, we finally could return home. After putting away the poles, Aaron headed inside. I stayed outside. I wanted to see the Zulu and see where he was staying. For some reason, he had seemed different. He looked like a beaten man. His head had been down all day, and I had not heard a sound from him. He had a distant look in his eyes. It seemed like his body was here, but his soul was far, far away. I finally caught sight of him. He was heading toward the back of the large structure. The old black man was with him. I looked up at the night sky. I looked for the stars that formed the shape of a drinking cup. My father showed me this years ago. I could not find them. I guess I was too far away from my home. I did know I was in another world, though, a world that was run by evil men. I felt alone at that moment and wanted to be with my family. I got up and went inside. I looked around and saw Mama asleep on her bed. She looked so peaceful. Jesse was balled up under his covers and Aaron was still on the floor. I lay down on my rags but could not sleep. I thought again about the Zulu and how quiet he had been. I wondered what was behind the large structure and why was he with the old black man? Wasn't he the one who had beaten him? Maybe he had been given some bad medicine and did not know what he was doing. I knew then that I would have to try and help him out somehow. But what could I do? I didn't know. All I knew was that I had to do something. That night I stayed out again. I waited for the Zulu. Again, they went behind the structure and this time I followed. I knew I had to be very quiet. As I peeped my head around the corner of the structure, I heard noises behind me. I turned and found Aaron creeping alongside the wall. As he neared, I could see him smiling. I thought he was inside asleep. I put my hand over his mouth and pulled him closer to me. I then looked again around the corner, but the Zulu was gone. As I stepped out from beside the structure, all I could see were trees and a pathway that led through the trees. I grabbed Aaron's arm and began to make my way through those trees. About halfway through, I heard voices. The voices were very soft, but I could make out the voice of the old black man. He was saying something in Zulu. I found an area where I could see through the trees and saw them sitting around a fire. They didn't seem to be enemies anymore. The old black man had taken off his top and was sitting next to the Zulu. They looked like brothers. The Zulu would say words and gesture, and then the old man would repeat them. Then he would say words, and the Zulu did the same. They were learning each other's language. I then turned to Aaron, and I could tell he understood what I wanted. After listening a while, we returned to the hut. I could not sleep, neither could Aaron. We went into the smaller room and spent the entire night learning each other's language. Thank you. That's it for the night. Tomorrow, 8 o'clock. Hope you have a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.